All right. Is that working? Hey guys, can you, is my stream coming through all right? Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I should be live now, so if anybody can just let me know if they are getting video and audio, that'd be great. Yeah, I should be live now. Awesome. Cool. I'm just going to give it a minute, just so everybody can come through since it took me a little while to get that fixed. Yeah, I'm not exactly what sure happened. I tested this a while ago and didn't change any of the settings, but it just kind of decided to do its own thing. So, but all right, it looks like it's working now. So let's see. Let's go here and here. All right, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, again, sorry that it was a little bit of a speed bump getting set up. I don't really know what was going on with the stream from before, but feel free to just filter through and catch on as I get started here. So, all right, so a few disclaimers before I start my talk. Yeah, so first of all, I'm fairly new to the community. I've only basically joined the community officially for about 6 months now. So if anything I say sounds a bit new or maybe a little inaccurate, that might have something to do with it. Also, my talk today is going to be largely theoretical. So if anything that I say sounds scientific, it's definitely not. It's pseudoscientific at best. And it should be taken with a grain of salt. Next, I've also gone ahead and, actually I'm going to go ahead and post my sources in the chat. Let me do that now, just in case anybody's interested and wants to reference them for later. Let's see. Oh, it's showing up as an image. Hold on, I should be able to do that as text. Let's go here, and let's go here. Yeah, let's try that again. There we go. Let's see. All right. All right, so yeah, so the sources are in the Discord chat. I'm also going to use Discord for all of the questions for after the talk as well, rather than YouTube, since, maybe not everybody here has a YouTube account, but everybody's definitely on Discord. So let's stick to there for questions, and I should be able to get to them after the talk, no problem. And lastly, I'm going to use my Artstream, which is basically the hour after this talk. And I'm going to use that to do basically a live demonstration of my art style right here. So feel free to stick around for that afterwards as well. It's going to be right on YouTube. Okay. So you can notice by the title of my talk today, right, that I've juxtaposed alter humanity with abstract art. But these two things are distinct, right? Like, we know that. Thing is, like, alter humanity, as we know, is the idea of having an identity that is non-human, whereas abstraction, on the other hand, is an art style. But both of these things are also lifestyles, and they're very particular types of lifestyles, in that both are ways of living that are predicated on an individual establishing a relationship with their own unconscious. And this fundamentally differs from other lifestyles, such as, say, weightlifting or maybe homesteading, for which the conscious mind is typically enough. But with alter humanity and abstraction, you can't really even get started without the help of the unconscious mind. And that's a very interesting foundation to share, and it suggests that they might also share a bit of a heritage, which is not always immediately obvious. And so I want to look at that shared heritage today and talk a bit about what the potential implications might be. All right, we should start with some terminology though. And I've actually made a bit of a hash of this myself in the description to this talk, because I've listed 3 different art styles, but actually there are meaningful distinctions between these 3. And that's something that I kind of figured out as I was researching for this talk, and maybe something that you're not familiar with as well. But I think it makes sense to clear them up because there are some really interesting kind of distinctions between the 3. So starting with abstract art, right? Abstract art is basically, it doesn't tell a coherent story, right? Like the colors, the textures, and the shapes themselves are kind of the primary feature of the piece, right? And you can kind of tell that from the example that I've included down below, right? There's no real reference to anything in the natural world or in the physical world. It's all really just, the colors, the shapes, and the textures, and those things are the primary features. And you can contrast that with surrealism. Surrealism, on the other hand, does tend to tell a story, but the story that it tells is often irrational and driven by unconscious free thinking. And you can kind of see that from this example that I've got here below as well, right? Like there are recognizable elements of the natural world, right? Such as the dog head over here in the mountains. You can kind of see like the optical illusion of a face here and the fruit bowl up above it. But those things taken together don't really tell a coherent or a rational story, right? It's kind of irrational and dreamlike. And that's what surrealism is really fundamentally about, because it's all about tapping into the unconscious and trying to create from that place that's unfettered by conscious constraints. And then the third style is visionary artwork, which is basically an art style that does tell a story, but that story is based on the portrayal of mystical experiences or transcendent visions. And it's probably something you're familiar with if you've ever seen these really colorful paintings that people do after basically taking psychedelic drugs or something like that. And, there's lots of color and lots of fractal geometries, and it's a very distinctive style, but again, it's distinct from surrealism and abstraction. All right, so it's kind of weird sometimes too, because there's some overlap between abstract art and surrealism, but with surrealism's focus on the unconscious, technically speaking, I would be more of a surrealist than anything else. And surrealism is kind of what I want to focus most of the talk on today. So basically just get rid of this, right? Good. Actually, I did fix it. Okay, good. I fixed it already. Okay, so yeah, so I want to focus on surrealism out of the 3, and basically, yeah. So I'm going to try and relate those to alter humanity as well. And in the alter human community, right, formally we recognize the dream shift, which is the transformation into a non-human entity or identity within the dream state. There's also the phantom shift, which is the sensation of non-human phantom body parts, sometimes voluntarily, but often involuntarily, especially in the beginning. There is also the mental shift, which is the experience of powerful non-human urges, such as the urge to bite or paw or make non-human vocalizations. And then finally, there's the sensory shift, which is the involuntary enhancement of the senses, such as hearing frequencies beyond the standard range of human hearing. But you can also look at these 4 from a different perspective, right? Because you can go and you can look at the dream shift and you can say, okay, well, that's basically the conscious mind descending into the unconscious during the dream state. So again, it's driven by the unconscious. There's the phantom shift as well, which is again, in the beginning especially, it's the presentation of a phantom body part that comes from an unconscious urge. There's also the mental shift, which is, okay, it's non-human behavior that's brought upon by a very powerful, again, unconscious urge. And then there's also the sensory shift, which is similarly, it's these senses, which are kind of an autonomic function that, again, they occur on their own. They're basically run by a part of the mind that's not consciously controlled. And so all four of these changes in behavior are rooted fundamentally, especially in the beginning, from unconscious experience and unconscious motivations. So again, I really want to focus on the unconscious today because both alter humanity and surrealism are lifestyles that draw heavily from unconscious motivations. And I think it makes sense for us to be interested in the unconscious and how it potentially creates a relationship that binds these two lifestyles together. And this is basically a roadmap for how I want to structure the talk today. I want to start by focusing on thinking about what the unconscious really is, and then bring that through to how the theory of the unconscious basically influenced the development of surrealism as an art style. And then towards the end, I want to bring these things together and kind of demonstrate what the cultural underpinnings are that bring them together with alter humanity. So you may already be familiar with the saying, "I think, therefore I am," which was made famous by the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. It was after he published his Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641. And the idea was put forth by Descartes as a way of trying to establish the philosophical foundations by which he could perceive and assert further elements of truth about the world around him. But even looking at this statement, you can probably see that there are some tenuous assumptions being made implicitly by Descartes, in the sense that he says, "I think, therefore I am," which assumes the existence of an I in the first place. And this became one of the common critiques of Descartes' statement, as people asserted that the most he was entitled to say was that some sort of thinking was occurring on its own, because he could not prove or assert any specifics about this supposed character I. And this is an astute observation, but it's also a troubling observation in that it leaves the fundamental question open: who or what am I? In 1899, the well-known psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud first published his work, The Interpretation of Dreams, where for the very first time he put forth a theory and a model of the human unconscious. And after studying the dream world clinically, Freud came up with this theory that there were different levels to the human psyche. He started with the conscious level, which he described as the thoughts and perceptions that we control and are aware of during waking life. Then there's the preconscious level that describes your memories and stored knowledge. You can think of stored knowledge basically as things that can be recalled with a little bit of mental effort, such as your elementary school teacher's last name. And then there's the unconscious level. These are thoughts that are typically repressed in day-to-day life, such as fears, violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, irrational wishes, immoral urges, selfish needs, shameful experiences, so on and so forth. And I should also note that it's not all as dark and dreary as this model necessarily suggests, right? Like, we understand now that creativity typically stems from the unconscious. Even irrational wishes don't necessarily have to be a bad thing. They're just things that don't conform to rational society, like a lot of alter humanity, for example. Now, Freud's model is also a model of the individual, right? So Descartes' I may be thought of in terms of this iceberg of conscious and unconscious thinking. And even more specifically, perhaps the I is best thought of as the conscious mind, whereas the unconscious is something broader and more mysterious. And I think it's important to note, though, that Freud's model was made possible only after human society became sufficiently centered on the human being, right? Because it wasn't always this way. Most societies in human history were intertwined closely with physical nature. Entire lifestyles were based on living off of and working with the land, and by extension, the creatures and life forms of the land. And the cultures themselves reflected that way of thinking as well. But as daily life became increasingly about the human experience at the behest of the natural world, the attention became increasingly focused on the functioning of the individual human mind. So what are the key differences between a society that's centered on the human and one that's not? What were we like before industrialization and globalization? Okay, so a society that's not centered on the human being is at least three things, in my opinion. First of all, it's open to and interested in the more than human world, which is basically nature, i.e. the plants and animals and landscapes and the cosmos, but also animist concepts like the spirits of the land, or human spirits after death in the spirit world. And I use more than human here as a catch-all phrase that refers to all of these things that are beyond material human society. Secondly, a society that's not human-centered is less individually focused and more communally focused. Right? So one of the consequences of a society integrated with the land is that the lifestyle is more strictly organized around surviving off of the land. And that requires a collective, cooperative community focus. The pressures, for example, of warding off predators and dealing with the elements are, and always have been, some of the things that keep families and communities together. And this last point is basically my main conjecture and my main observation, right? And that's basically that the abstract structure of the human mind itself reflects this receptivity to the more than human world. And that's what I want to get into a little bit more. So let's have another look at the iceberg model that we discussed earlier. And let's start here on the left, and let's assume that, okay, so from Freud's model, that was basically 20% above the water. So 20% conscious mind and 80% unconscious mind, right? And let's also remember that this sort of 80-20 modern setup tends to be individually focused on average, right? But at the extremes, it might become narcissistic or tend towards narcissism. So let's keep that in mind, and let's call this the Freudian model. We can contrast that with what I'll call the indigenous mind, which approximates what our minds were like for thousands of years of human civilization. And we'll estimate something like, let's just say 45% above rather than 20, and 55% below rather than 80, which again results in a mind that is more communally focused on average, but potentially more enmeshed with one another at the extremes. And I want to point out real quick, scrolling up, that, all right, so lowering the water level down to 45% doesn't necessarily mean that we're not changing the structure of the iceberg, we're just lowering the water level, right? So it's not like you bring it down and you've got 45% on top, and that's 45% thoughts and perceptions. It's just that you lower the water level and then you've got 45% encompassing thoughts, perceptions, memories, stored knowledge, and probably some proportion of the unconscious thoughts as well. Right, so both minds have their strengths and their weaknesses, and somehow over thousands of years of human civilization, a shift occurred and we moved from the indigenous model to the modern Freudian model. All right, but before we go further, right, we should clarify some things about how this indigenous model works, because how is it, after all, that I'm presuming that the water level was necessarily lower under the indigenous model? Well, it has something to do with how our mind perceives the world around it. And a culture that's embedded in a more than human world, like an indigenous culture, necessarily requires a more than human mind to engage with it. Now, I'll get into this with a few examples later, but just as a thought experiment, consider how you sometimes feel when you're stuck inside, right? Something that we're all familiar with considering the lockdown. But it's kind of stuffy, right? We're trapped inside these little steel or wooden or concrete boxes, completely cut off from the rest of the world, to the point where it can get nauseating. Contrast that, however, to when you step outside. If it's a nice day, the air is refreshing, the warmth of the sunlight washes over your body. If it's a rainy day, maybe you get drenched, which is not so nice, but at least you're feeling something substantial. And that's because the natural world is inherently more sensuous, and it engages with you actively as soon as you step out into it. And that's what indigenous lifestyles were like. They invigorated the five senses, and even the more intuitive sixth sense, right? So those unconscious sensory shifts could simply serve their natural purposes, because indigenous lifestyles were flooded constantly with sensory inputs, stimulated by physical nature and their relationship with physical nature. And in this way, the unconscious mind was grounded by physical nature, much the way you ground an electrical circuit to prevent it from overloading the system. So the phenomenologist David Abram wrote an excellent book titled The Spell of the Sensuous that describes this sort of thing in detail. And in his book, he describes the indigenous shamans who are often the creators and conservators of indigenous culture. They were known as healers and magicians and medicine men, really brilliant individuals who were charged with keeping the tribe safe by using ritual practices to maintain spiritual balance between the human world and their more than human neighbors. And he describes the shaman saying that his magic is his heightened receptivity to the meaningful solicitations, songs, cries, and gestures of the more than human field. And so he distinguishes between magic in the performative, more colloquial sense, and magic in the relatively mundane sense of being open to the sensuous solicitations of the natural world, and by understanding and being receptive to the language of the natural world. And so the shamans would use this sensitivity to shape the cultures of their tribes, keeping them respectful of and in balance with the more than human world. Okay, 3 examples of this, right? The first comes from the Koyukon people of Alaska, who, in preparation for a hunt, would utilize a technique called circumlocution. The word circumlocution literally means the use of many words where fewer would do, especially in a deliberate attempt to be vague or evasive. In other words, they would assume the animals themselves could hear their conversations, and as a result, would try to avoid referring to the animals directly in conversation, so as to avoid offending them, because they understood that if they brashly insulted the spirits of the animals, that would make capturing them more difficult. And so instead of referring to the red squirrel directly, for example, they had a phrase, which I'm not going to attempt to say, but it would translate to the one that is on the side of a tree, right, rather than referring to it directly. And for the lynx, they had a phrase that translated to something going around, right? And the second example comes from the Hopi of northern Arizona, who conceptualized space and time as intertwined concepts long before Einstein's theory of general relativity. So instead of having distinct concepts of past, present, future, and location, they instead conceptualized space-time as the manifested and the manifesting, where the manifesting referred to those dimensions of reality that were yet to be observed and uncovered. On the other hand, a practical example of the manifested can be considered from the geological record maintained by the rings of a tree trunk, wherein the age of a tree can be uncovered by cutting open the trunk and observing the number of concentric rings. So again, it makes space-time a very practical and tangible concept meant to be interpreted actively by the senses. And the last is a rather poetic conceptualization of the winds by the Navajo, who, when referencing the act of breathing in the air, referred to them as the winds that enter a human being and leave their traces in the swirling patterns of the fingers, toes, and hairs. So again, it's a very poetic but also a very sensuous way of conceptualizing not only the wind, but also the oneness of the human body with the atmosphere of the earth. I think the sensuous and experiential nature of the indigenous mindset is really well summarized by this poem. It was written by a descendant of Aboriginal Australians, and it reads, "If it wasn't for the footprints we would not know about before, and Australia's history we have today would not make sense anymore. If it wasn't for the footsteps which created the path we share, our survival in this landscape would lead us to nowhere. If it wasn't for the footpaths still here from that long ago, our heritage in writing would only reflect our woes. If it wasn't for the footprints which were made into the sand, the ones left by ancestors, our Aboriginal clans. If it wasn't for their footsteps which carved the land and lore, Australians would not know about these footprints from before." And there's a very strong emphasis here from the writer on the overwhelming preference that Indigenous people have for maintaining their culture through oral traditions and ritual experiences, a history maintained by continually walking the path of the ancestors and leaving footprints of practical experience for future generations, right? And this is as opposed to the overwhelming preference by the West to maintain their history in writing, which is a comparatively dead medium, sensuously speaking. and using writing, as the author insists, would only reflect the woes of the indigenous people. This is a massive point of differentiation, and perhaps the single greatest contributing factor to the transformation of the indigenous mind into the Freudian mind. The oral traditions, which were grounded in sensuous, practical, and communal experiences, would eventually lose out to the sheer utility and scalability afforded by the written word, and as such, the water level would begin to rise, drowning out the voice of the unconscious. Consider, for example, the ability we all have nowadays to keep a private journal. Not only can you now voice your own true thoughts and feelings privately, but you can do so permanently, referring back to them after several years, effectively making yourself permanent and grounding yourself in your own perspective. And this kind of objective self-persistence would simply have been impossible in an indigenous setting. And it's even more powerful today, with the ability to create online profiles, which are essentially permanent records of yourself stored on the cloud, completely impervious to destruction, for example, by wildfires or from accidentally being misplaced. Again, that's a personal history that's totally impossible within the confines of an oral communal tradition. But again, there's a price, and that price is the suppression of the senses and the repression of the unconscious. It asks an interesting question about where the potential point of transition was from the oral traditions to the written word. Ancient Hebraic traditions, for example, were far more similar to indigenous traditions in that they were intertwined with the sensuous natural world prior to the adoption of the Semitic alphabet. And the adoption of the Aleph Bet and the creation of the written Torah laid the foundation for Hebraic cultural tradition to become an increasingly mental game centered around the interpretation of a book rather than a sensuous game stimulated by an ongoing relationship with physical nature. And no longer would the entire community participate in these rituals, but rather specialist rabbis would create elaborate abstract systems, such as the Kabbalah and the practice of gematria, further separating the experience from the average Hebrew, with the interpretation of the Torah becoming an increasingly individualistic and specialized experience. And with the widespread adoption of the written word, our indigenous connection to the more sensuous natural world was lost, making life in modern society akin to a perpetual state of sensory deprivation. And of course, this spelt bad news for the unconscious, which yearns to be grounded in the sort of sensuous experiences that are stimulated by physical nature. So the water has officially risen, drowning out the unconscious and posing a very particular dilemma for the Freudian mind, because the unconscious needs to be expressed, but a human-centered society is no longer organized to allow its safe expression. Because unlike the indigenous mind, which was grounded in the stimulation provided by physical nature, the Freudian mind is grounded in little more than shag rugs and tapered ceilings. But we also know that the unconscious can't simply be repressed, because the psychoanalysts have already proven that the effects of doing so are detrimental to the psyche, and thus detrimental to society. This repression of the unconscious was a major problem in the early 20th century, and André Breton, a young poet who served as a French combat medic in World War I, was particularly taken by this dilemma. It was probably his background in medicine and his first-hand experience as of the psychiatric aftermath of the war that led him to concluding that the war itself might have been a manifestation of the cultural and intellectual rigidity imposed upon Western society by the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. He was able to seize upon Freud's work not only as a medical professional but also as an artist, and in 1924 he defined surrealism as an artistic lifestyle predicated on Freud's findings. Specifically, he defined surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason and exempted from any aesthetic or moral concerns. Okay, so he wanted surrealism to be an expression of unfettered, unconscious free thinking, effectively as a means of psychotherapy, and he zeroed in on this concept of psychic automatism. Actually, the word automatism itself describes an action performed unconsciously or involuntarily. And maybe you can begin to see the parallel here, right? Because it kind of sounds like an alterhuman awakening, which also happens, at least in the beginning, unconsciously and involuntarily. And again, in Breton's opinion, this sort of liberation of the unconscious mind had the potential to prevent further world wars if practiced widely. Well, it's such a powerful concept, the idea of preventing wars by adopting more liberal lifestyles. So powerful that Breton was able to organize an entire movement of writers, poets, painters, really artists from all genres, and together they pioneered the surrealist lifestyle as a way of intentionally unlocking the potential of the unconscious. All right, so I've got just 3 surrealist paintings here that I want to put up for a few minutes. Just keep that idea in your mind as you look at them about how surrealism is driven by unfettered, unconscious, free thinking, right? The stuff of dreams, right? And just keep that in mind as you look at these pictures. Right, here's the second one that you can see from Yves Tanguy. Again, there's no rational, central, overarching narrative here, right? It's just the result of unconscious, unfettered, free thinking. It doesn't have to make sense. And a third here, right? So this one's a little bit different from the 2 that came before it because it's mostly comprised of flat colors or flat block colors and texture, but again, it's made with the same fundamental approach artistically, right? Unconscious, unfettered, free thinking. So the surrealists failed, basically, right? Because after World War I came World War II and the Vietnam War and so on and so forth, right? But it was such a poignant idea to at least try to improve daily life by expressing the unconscious creatively. But thinking about it, maybe they were limited largely by the times as well, right? Because the 1900s were a real grind, existentially speaking. Daily life was difficult enough, and as the world that we were living then was still slow-paced and mostly analog, with lots of necessary but restrictive obligations placed on the individual in order to keep the machinery of society churning over. But I think the advent of the internet and social media have largely liberated us from that sort of grinding existential slog. And so I wonder if the advent of social media has actually somehow saved the Freudian mind, or at least offered it a way out. Think of it like this, right? There's no logical way back to a more agrarian or indigenous society, right? Not with all this technological advancement. But what is it that potentially fills the void of the sensuous stimulation of physical nature? Well, what about us, right? We all put stuff out onto social media every day, right? Those creations, or those little micro creations, have emotional and intellectual value, supposedly. And they can be shared across the entire world instantly. So we stimulate one another, right? How about, I'm going to go back up to the iceberg for a quick second here. Okay. So how about, for example, a creepypasta to reawaken the fear of getting mauled by a bear? Or maybe an OnlyFans account for unacceptable sexual desires? Or how about deep web stories for immoral urges? Right? Or how about therianthropy for the so-called irrational wish to want to be a bird or a snail? Right? And the validation that we all get from collectively participating in these kinds of subcultures together provides the kind of emotional satiation that we need in order to survive. Here we are. So if we look at it from that perspective, we can see that social media actually proxies physical nature. And it provides us the unconscious stimulation that we've been seeking for generations now. In lifestyles such as surrealism and alterhumanity replace the indigenous rituals of the Aboriginal tribes, right? You and I as creators on the internet are reinvigorating each other's senses and filling the emotional and intellectual voids created by Western society and the advent of the Freudian mind. And this last one's important too, right? The individuality that's afforded by the Freudian structure rather than being trapped in a never-ending dilemma, is now potentially preserved and refined. So one of the things that really strikes me about Alter Humanity, specifically the language of Alter Humanity, is the word kinship. And I think it really describes perfectly what we're all charged with doing as we work to understand ourselves better. Because when we establish a functional kinship with our own unconscious, I think we stand to benefit across all walks of life. And it's something that I rely upon myself whenever I'm struggling with my own identity, right? Because the unconscious, as a gateway to otherness, is always there, regardless of how it may present itself on any given day. And I think the mythical concept of the Ouroboros, or the proverbial snake eating its own tail, describes this kinship with the unconscious best. Because after all, it was said that the Ouroboros is often taken to symbolize introspection, the eternal return or cyclicality, eventually especially in the sense of something constantly recreating itself. It also represents the infinite cycle of nature's endless creation and destruction, of life and of death. And, as much as I like the classical Ouroboros, with the snake eating its own tail on the left, these days, I find the modern depiction of the kind Ouroboros, caring for itself, really compelling as well. As it cares for itself the way that the conscious and the unconscious mind often care for one another. And that's my talk. Thank you. All right, so I'm just getting over to the chat now for questions. So I'll try and read through things. I think we've got, just a little over 15 minutes left to the Artstream, so I'll see what I can get through. Sorry, I'm only just getting to the chat, so if there were any questions up above, I'm gonna have to see if I can find them, unless you want to start reposting them. There's a QA too. Cheers, guys. Thank you. Oh, it's a QA anyway. Any questions? You're gonna have to repost them, because if they were posted earlier, I completely missed them. I wasn't really able to pay attention. Let's see. Okay, I guess there's a chat here. Will the conclusion be, therefore, Otherkin phenomena might be consequence of an early alphabet? Yeah, I mean, I think that's... I'm not sure if I would put it all down to the phonetic alphabet, but that's an important, right? Like, it's hard, right? Because first of all, if this idea of the Freudian model versus the indigenous model is true, then it means that what we're effectively trying to do in 2020 is theorize about the indigenous mind, but we're doing that from the perspective of the Freudian mind, right? Because we're all living in the Freudian mind on a day-to-day basis. And of course, none of this stuff is, because right, it's mental and it's abstract. It's not really something that you can necessarily track via statistics or through historical records or oral traditions or anything like that, right? Like I think the Freudian model itself was only established in 1899, and of course that doesn't necessarily mean that that's when that model would have become relevant on some level, but it means that that was the perspective at that time. And if you think about human history throughout the several thousands of years, or civilization rather, throughout the several thousand of years of its existence, it's a little bit difficult to see or to think about how you would try to measure something like that, right? It's kind of like with alter humanity, right? Like it's all subjective, and it's all fundamentally taking place in your own mind. And so it's something that's hard to think about objectively, and by its very nature is something that you can really only theorize about. But I think the interesting thing to think about is just, yeah, like that's one of the things that I didn't personally know about so much, in terms of just like the sheer impact that the written word had on human culture in general. But I think this thing, especially like that idea of like being able to keep a journal, right, where you basically write to and talk to yourself, right? That really effectively changes the focus of the mind and the intention of the mind in a way that, you know, again, without the ability to write and refer back to yourself privately, you know, you kind of don't really have an analog for that outside of the written word. So you have to think that once we started doing that and started doing that en masse, it had some kind of meaningful impact on how our minds developed, right? Again, it's something that would be difficult to measure, but it's something that more likely than not happens in some sense. So let's see. I think they said there's some more stuff on Discord. Let's see. If you haven't talked about it already, may I ask about your process when you create your alter humanity related to Surrealist art? Yeah, totally. So, I mean, that's what I'm going to do basically starting at 9 is I'm going to basically try and do a live demonstration. But the process is actually one of the most interesting things, because the process itself is something that, you know, as I'm doing it, I'm also thinking a lot about alter humanity and kind of the language of alter humanity, right? So we have this whole thing about the questioning and the confirming process. And when I start a piece, right, I don't really start with any intention, because the idea is to try to leverage whatever my unconscious is churning over, right, without me being aware of it, and just have it kind of bubble up naturally through my hand, essentially, or through my pencil as I'm drawing. So what's interesting to think about is that if I don't have any intention, if I'm just starting with basically pure uncertainty, each stroke that I make of the pencil is kind of like a question, right? It's like a question that I'm posing to my own unconscious, right? Basically asking it to show me something or reveal to me something that I can recognize, right? So like, for example, there's a piece in my art table, or actually you can even think about the piece that I had here at the beginning of my talk, which was a black swan, right? But it didn't start that way, right? Like I think I remember starting this piece up here from the top left, and I didn't really know what I was going to make. But it was just throughout the process of making it, right, after I got through the head and maybe started doing the neck, that I said, okay, this kind of looks like a swan. Like maybe I can take it in that direction, which is kind of what you do when you question as well, right? Maybe you have some dreams, or you experience some sort of behavioral shift, right? A mental shift. And you don't necessarily know exactly what it is. Or oftentimes when it shows you something, or oftentimes what you see initially is not what it ends up being, maybe a month down the line or 3 months down the line. And that's effectively the questioning process, right? So in kind of a macroscopic, or rather a microscopic way, like when I'm making a piece, right, each stroke is kind of like I'm questioning, right? I'm questioning that particular piece in that particular moment, but I'm questioning my unconscious to show me something in that moment that I can use. And so the whole thing just builds up from that kind of uncertain questioning. Let's see. Off topic, when you have a second, will your Artstream also be on YouTube, or will it be on Discord? It'll probably, I'll leave it up on YouTube. Yeah, the video should be up on YouTube as well. So I can circle back with the link if you need to, and I can help you with the announcement, no problem. Yeah, Freudian psychology is, I don't believe in Freudian psychology. It's a questionable thing, right? Of course, there was Jung after Freud and a whole bunch of people after that. So, people have their opinions, but I just went with that because that was the first time in history that somebody formalized a model of the unconscious. And I thought it was really interesting, especially because Freud based that model off of his clinical research into the dream world. So, another question: do you think that people can intentionally unlock kin identities by unlocking that unconscious self? Also, what are your kin types? That's a great question. And so I've kind of mentioned this before on Therian Amino, which is where I kind of, again, I started hanging out about 6 months ago. I had basically some human experiences that go back about 5.5 years. And what's kind of weird about me and something that I'm trying to think about myself is that, all of my shifts, like all of my phantom shifts and behavioral shifts, those things started presenting fairly late in life for me, right? So I'm 30 years old, but I was 25 when I started having these experiences. And another thing that's weird is that I started having these experiences only after I was basically working on writing. So I'm working on writing a novel that's largely based on kind of the sort of stuff that I was talking about today, right? Foundations about the natural world and human culture and things like that. And so for me, it's not that I didn't know about alter humanity at the time, and I wasn't necessarily trying to go that way. But for me, it's interesting because I don't think I didn't really start having those experiences until I was kind of immersing myself in the topic of the natural world and things of that sense, and kind of learning more about how physics really works and all that stuff. I did like a lot of like re-educating myself over the last few years, from basically how the way that we grow up and all the stuff that we learn isn't necessarily factual when we learn more about how the world actually works. And for me, alter humanity is part of that. So I don't know, for me, it's almost like I'm looking at your question. It's not even like I intentionally tried to unlock that in myself, but I think there's something about the larger, I guess, journey of life and we don't know what it is, right? Because everybody awakens at a different age for different reasons, and it's different things, right? So you can be, you don't necessarily have to be Therian, you can be Otherkin, you can be fictionkin, right? It can be all sorts of things, and it's not really clear what it is or where the point of initiation is. I think another interesting thing is that I often, when I'm making my art pieces, in the beginning, I didn't really know what I was doing. And then there was like a critical point somewhere in the middle where I started making them and they felt like they were purely just coming unconsciously, like without any kind of intentional perspective or anything like that. And then now I'm at a place where it's kind of like sometimes it's more unconscious, but sometimes it's partially conscious, right? There's like a spectrum there. And so I don't think it's ever completely clear where it starts or where it comes from, but it's a really interesting question to think about. Let's see. Let's see if I can find any more, if I've missed anything here. Another question. Let's see. That's one. So what I'm wondering now, what if everyone is kin in some way, but only those who have access to their unconscious selves can access it? That would lend a lot to the theory of kin coming from other dimensions or being reincarnations. I think that's a really interesting point, actually. Right? That's a big question. We don't know, right? Like we don't know. I guess the thing that's interesting to me is that we know all human beings have some element of a conscious and an unconscious experience, but we don't exactly know the details of how those things are organized, right? And again, like you also have to think about chronologically speaking, like when does the awakening as an alter human happen? And is it that you were always alterhuman, or was it that you became alterhuman from the point of awakening, right? So we know that it happens for some of us, you know, at some point along that timeline of our own lives, but we don't know basically as if it's something that's available to all human beings, or, you know, can you know based off of, you know, just the fact, or can you make a presumption just based off of the fact that we all have some element of an unconscious experience? I don't know. It's a really interesting question, and it's a completely open question. Let's see. Let's see. Modern, including sources about modern ideas after Freud and Jung. I'm pretty unfamiliar with anything about them. Yeah. Or how do you know the sources more? Yeah, I've probably got a few sources in the list that I posted to the chat earlier, but I don't. Let's see. I have to look back in. This is stuff that I've been thinking about for a few years, so I probably have some stuff around that I don't have necessarily organized. But if it's anything that's related to this talk, it would more or less likely be in the notes that I posted earlier. I don't know if they're pinned up here. Yeah, here they are. But I think, yeah, one of the best references that I used for this talk was that book, The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abrams. So if anyone's really interested in diving into, especially like a lot of that phenomenological stuff and a lot of the history of like the indigenous tribes and so on and so forth, I think that book was really kind of one of the main ones that I leaned on. Let's see. All right, I've only got 2 minutes left, so I will see if I can find any other questions. If not, I'm just going to jump into the Artstream. Let's see if there's anything on YouTube. One minute left. Am I an academic by trade? No, but thank you. Yeah, I don't know. This is just stuff that I've been researching for a few years now. So I used to do some research, but that was in computer science, which is not at all related. And that was when I was an undergrad. So not really, but yeah, academic research is always something that I've been interested in. So I try to read as many papers and books as I can when I'm interested in the topic. But thanks again. Yeah. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and, well, I'm not really going to change anything, but I'm going to basically just switch my camera over to, or switch my stream over to my camera, and I'll jump into the Artstream. Turn off the display. Again, so I'm basically just going to try and model for you guys what it is that I do and kind of what it is that I was talking about in terms of psychic automatism or surrealist automatism, which is that technique that Baton described. So let me go from here and just throw on some music too. I usually like to listen to music when I'm doing this. Cool. Hope the volume's all right. And I'm just going to get started. I'm going to go for about an hour. So if you have any more questions or anything like that, feel free to throw them out there. I might not see them as I'm working, but if I pop my head up every now and again and I see something, I'll see if I can answer whatever it is. But thanks again, guys, for attending the panel, and for everyone who's interested in the Artstream, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So another thing I'll mention is that it's kind of apparent from what I'm doing. I don't really know if I'm going to draw anything interesting today. I'd say there's probably like an 80 to 85% hit rate that I come through with something that is kind of really in line with the style that you can see in like my gallery. But again, I've got another stream tomorrow and another stream on Sunday, so let's just see what I can do. Let me check out this as well. See how my lighting is. Okay, that's not too bad. Art is so full of trial and error. Yep. That's literally all this style is trial and error. But again, there's an unconscious element there that directs you even when you don't necessarily perceive it directing you, and that's what makes it so interesting. So. Oh, jeez. There we go. Cheers, guys. Glad you like the music. I typically tend anywhere from dance to metal. Those are my two favorite genres. Metal when I need motivation, dance when I kind of want to relax a little bit more. Cool, yeah. I see you're picking up. I picked up on something too here. So, another thing I really like about this style is when I was first kind of trying to describe it to other people, I said, think of it kind of the way you would think of like an ink blot test or a Rorschach test, which is, again, another one of those psychoanalytical tools, right? You drop the ink blot or a blotch of ink on a piece of paper and you ask your client, what do you see or what do you interpret? And it's another good way of just kind of training your mind to think in terms of abstraction, right? Another thing that's great about it is it's like whatever you see can be valid too, right? Like one person may see a horse where someone else sees a gazelle or a zebra or something else entirely, right? So but yeah, no, if you're interested in making abstract art, definitely I will say this isn't something that I knew how to do. Let's see, I've only been doing this for about 2 years when you think about it. So yeah, I mean I've been creative my whole life and I've always made artwork, but I was kind of the same way. Like my rational mind would kind of always interfere and want to take over, and I didn't really get what the abstract impetus was. I didn't really know how to just how to go about thinking about doing it. And so it's definitely something that I think, especially people that are in the alter human community, like, again, you've already got that relationship with your subconscious activated to a degree. So I think it's something that definitely, if you're creative as well, it probably already influences how you work, but it's something that can, kind of be built upon over time as well. So, but yeah, I only really started developing this style about 2 years ago, and before that, I was mostly into making like anime characters, or basically just like knockoffs of Dragon Ball Z or whatever anime I was into at the time. I had an OC from a really, really long time ago when I was still in grade school, but yeah, no, abstract art is something that's still really new for me as well. Unicorn or Kieran. I'm just gonna let you think whatever you want to think. I've got another one, and I've got something in mind, but the animal is on the more obscure side. But you'll see it after I paint it. You got the right form though. We're all looking at the same thing, but again, you know, that's the beauty. Like, I'll see one thing, you'll see something else, and it can all be valid. I've even had pieces where I'll look at it right side up and then I'll turn it this way or that way and I'll see something completely different. So that's something else to do as well, right? Typically after I'm done, I'll step back again and see if I can basically pick out anything else. So it's the gift that keeps on giving, yeah? Let's see. I'm wondering. Let's see. So again, I don't know if anybody else sees it. I'm just going to throw out what I'm seeing. I see a capybara. I got the ear here. I got the eye. Got the snout. And I could draw even like some buck teeth in there. And you got that fat capybara belly. Got the arm when they stand up on their hind legs. That's what I'm seeing. But again, it could be anything, right? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you got the posture. Yeah, we got the rabbit there. Yep. I was thinking rabbit too because of the way that I drew the snout. Kind of looks more rabbit-like, but I forget exactly how the nose is on a capybara. Whether it's either up here or down here somewhere. I think it's up here. But one of the things that I try to stick to when I'm making these pieces is I don't necessarily want to use references too much because I'm trying to maintain that balance between conscious and unconscious influence. And so sometimes, you know, it makes sense to use the reference, but I want the foundation of the piece really to just kind of be what it is. Which is why I said again, there's always an element of uncertainty in doing this, right? Like, you know, maybe 10-15% of the time I don't really get anything interesting or nature-based, but most of the time I do. And I think right now I'm seeing the capybara. Let's see if I can. There we go. It's like a capybara getting his mind blown or something. Sorry, guys. I put like, man, I put a lot of information into that panel. Like, there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about in more detail, but I don't know. I was trying to condense a lot of things into only 45 minutes of space, so I know it was a lot of information. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, but I hope at least the basic idea came across clearly. I just kind of wanted to draw the parallel between the unconscious and how it plays into the lifestyle of surrealism and how it also plays into the lifestyle of altered humanity. Again, especially like when the questioning process can be so frustrating, because one day you're one thing and then a few months down the line you say, you know what, deconfirming, right? But the one constant throughout that whole process is the unconscious. And I see the unconscious basically as a gateway to otherness, right? So whatever it is, or whatever it is you might be, even though it may be in flux in the moment, you always have something going on, and you always have a relationship with your own unconscious, right? It's always there, regardless of whatever shape it takes on in the moment. Cheers, guys. Really appreciate some of the nice comments coming through. I think one of the things I've got my animal down here, be it capybara or rabbit or whatever. And so now I think more, or I like to try to think more about space. Like, how am I handling all the negative white space, and, you know, do these elements here at the top, do they look proper? Because it's also about maintaining proportion, right? So now it's like, now that I've got what I was looking for down here, or what I wanted, I can think a little bit more with my conscious mind and try to put a bit of cohesion and rational thinking into the overall aesthetic of the piece. Cheers, guys. Thanks. Another thing that's interesting is if you look at like any of the old stuff in my gallery, you can see like there have been episodes almost, right? Like, you can see that I've been developing the style and that it's changed over time. And so sometimes the lines are smoother the way that they are in this piece, but sometimes I've got more rigid elements as well, and it's always evolving and always adapting, and I just kind of try to stay with it wherever it's in. I try to stay with it as it is. Another thing that I try to do with this style is anytime I make a mistake, like you see I just made a mistake right here, I just try to incorporate it, all right, rather than using the eraser. And if you're an artist, this is probably something that you've heard somewhere or other in art class or just online somewhere. It's, you know, try and work with your errors or your little mistakes as they crop up along. And abstract art, or again surrealism as this is technically speaking, it's really great for that, because you don't have to conform to an overall vision. So anytime in the moment where you see something that's a little bit off, you can always incorporate it, right? So these little tiny strokes can do whatever they want, and the overall picture is not overwhelmingly trying to, you know, put you in any one direction. You have the freedom to work with your mistakes the way you wouldn't necessarily have if you were making a still life, for example. Right. Yeah, I'm the same way with pencil versus digital. Like, I think a lot of it has to do with just the fact that, like, I've got a really crappy tablet. Like, I've got like the cheapest tablet you can possibly buy. I think it was like $20 or something on Amazon. But like, I started using tablets when I was in 8th grade. So like, there weren't that many like today, you've got basically like the tablet PCs, right, with like the screens, and they're basically just monitors that you can plug in and you can draw them directly. Like I still use, here I go, like I say, I've got it over here. I still use this, which is just like, just the pad. There's no screen, right? And you just kind of have to look at the actual monitor as you're using it. And so I think to really enjoy digital the way that you enjoy traditional, I think you need those, I guess, more or fancier drawing tablets. But since I've never had one, I've kind of been resistant to, I guess, adopting digital as much as I do. I mean, I still use it, of course, but I don't know. There's also just the feeling itself of putting pencil to paper. Like nothing can really, you really can't mirror that feeling of the texture of the paper. Wacom used to try, like they have all these different pen nibs that you can use that are supposed to simulate the way paper feels, but it never really works out that way, so. Yeah, every piece I do typically, even if I start it traditionally, I'll typically scan it and finish it digitally. So yeah, there's a cleanliness that you can only get with the digital medium, definitely, for sure. iPad, yeah, I would imagine iPad is pretty good for that. I'd be curious to see how the iPad stacks up against like some of those fancy, like expensive drawing tablets I was talking about, the ones that are basically like tablet PCs. Imagine they have custom styluses too for the iPad that are meant for drawing, rather than the ones that are just meant for navigation. Yeah, this Cappy's definitely tripping out on psilocybin or something. Let's see. Yeah, well, let's let's agree to graduate up to the fancier tablets someday. That's all. I always want to try one. Like something I always like, even back in the day, like the old Wacoms, I always imagined like, man, this would be so much easier if they just had an actual like LCD screen on them. Someday. I'm getting close to that point where I don't want to add too many more elements to this one. Let's see, I've got 10 minutes left. All right, let me see if I can, I'm going to see if I can finagle with it for the last 10 minutes. Sometimes they usually take me about an hour to make, but if I end up finishing one early, I'll sometimes just switch over and start a new one from scratch. But let's see what I can do in this piece here. Yeah, I think that's the thing about Apple, right? Like their tech isn't all that much different from the other guys, but they always mark it up way more than it needs to be. So it's always way more expensive than it should be. I use Mac though, so I'm not complaining. Catalina's a disaster though. God, what an awful operating system Catalina turned out to be. Can't believe they got rid of backwards compatibility for 32-bit. Which means I can't game anymore. least not the way I used to be. Trying to figure out what I want to do with. I've got a stream tomorrow at the same time, an art stream, and again on Sunday. And I'm trying to figure out if I should start from scratch tomorrow and do another one, or see if I can finish this piece by Sunday, which means outline it, scan it, color it, and then after I scan it, touch it up and finish it in Photoshop. Maybe I'll do all that, but I don't know. I don't think about it. Yeah, I used to be a programmer too, so I don't know. I honestly never liked Windows for anything other than playing games. To be after as soon as they came out with what was it, Windows 7, everything from 7 onwards was trash, in my opinion. I like accessing Unix too, so the fact that you can do that on a Mac is great. I was never much of a fan of Linux, but at least having the Unix kernel is nice. Yeah, we'll see. I'll think about it and just kind of figure it out at the last minute. I usually figure everything out at the last minute, so we'll just go with the flow and see what happens. Let's see. Alright, 7 minutes. I'm just going to keep touching up this piece. I just want to thank you guys again for stopping by my art stream, and of course if you were here for the talk as well. Really appreciate dropping by and being interested in what I gotta say. And I'm sure I'll catch you guys at some of the other talks. I'm going to pretty much everything this weekend, so feel free to shout me out if you see me hanging around. Cheers, thanks guys. Yeah, glad you enjoyed it. Yeah. Going in the deep and wild. Yeah, that's kind of the fun of it. Yeah. The thing is, all this stuff, you know, you think about philosophy and science and history and all that stuff, and you think of it as distinct, right? All distinct from art, but it's really not. It's all basically like every field is really just another perspective for observing and thinking about life and what life is. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. You're always thinking in some way about the natural world and kind of what it all means and how it all works and functions. But, that's why it's so easy to make connections between these things, because again, like it doesn't always seem that way on the surface, but fundamentally we're all talking about the same stuff, which is it's pretty cool. Yeah, I like how this one came out. I don't always get, like an animal species or a plant species, but I'm usually always satisfied with the end result in one way or another, which is why it's nice doing these. They're freeform and they usually don't disappoint too much. Cheers, guys. Have a good one. All right, guys, sign off. Cheers. Thanks a lot.